In this video of the After Effects Fundamental series, you'll learn how to import artwork from Adobe Illustrator to use in your After Effects animations. While there's a lot that you can do with the native shape layers in After Effects, when you want to create more complex illustrations, it's definitely better to use Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop. This video will cover how to prepare your Illustrator artwork, how to import it into After Effects, and what changes you can make in Illustrator after you've already imported it. Remember that I have these handy visual guides that go with all the videos in this After Effects Fundamentals series. We're going to start in Adobe Illustrator because there's a few things that you need to do to prepare your artwork before you bring it into After Effects. The first thing that you need to do is make sure that you only have one Illustrator artboard in your file. So if I zoom out here, you can see that I actually have 3 different artboards. If I move this background off, you can see that these are the artboards. After Effects only will recognize one artboard, so we need to just separate these into different files, or in this case, it just makes sense to have one file, and then I can change out the text for the different thumbnails that I need. If you were doing a longer animation project, like an explainer video, and you had your storyboards kind of mapped out in Illustrator with different artboards, that's great to work on storyboards, but when you get into importing those Illustrator files into After Effects, you're going to want to break them up so that each scene or each piece that you're going to animate is in its own Illustrator file. If you're not totally sure how many artboards you have, you can go up to Window and then Artboards if you don't already have this panel on your screen. So you can see here that I have 3 artboards. So you can delete artboards from here by using this little trash can, or you can use the artboard tool here and then just have whichever one you want selected and then just hit delete and then delete over here too. And I'm just going to keep this center one for our Illustrator files example. So notice how the artwork has actually stayed. So I'm going to also just delete all of this artwork and also all of this artwork. And now we just have the artwork that we need. You can close this window too. If any of your artwork is completely off the artboard, it won't show up in After Effects. If you have a layer that's partially off the artboard like this, After Effects will cut off whatever's not on the artboard. So you might want to just move the layer all the way onto the artboard if you need to have the whole thing. That way you can just move it back in After Effects to where you wanted it, and you'll have the whole layer to work with. Before moving on to the next step in preparing your Illustrator artwork for After Effects, I'm going to actually simplify my artwork. Because in the design that I made for this fundamental series, I had a ton of different layers, so I'm just simplifying it to make it easier for this lesson. The next thing that you need to do to prepare your Illustrator file is to make sure that everything that you want to be animated is separated out into its own layer. If you go over to the Layers panel, which if you don't see this on your screen, just go to Window and then Layers. Right now I just have layer 1, so that is including everything that's in this Illustrator file. So if you toggle down, you can see all of these different things. Some things are grouped, and then some things are just named like rectangle or path or whatever. So what we need to do is separate all of these things into their own layers so that they're not nested under layer 1. They're actually their own layer at the same level as this layer 1. So there's actually a quick way to do this, and that's just to select layer 1, then go up to this hamburger menu, and then you want to go to Release Layers to Sequence. And now you can see that these are all named like layer 2, layer 3, and so on, but notice how they're still underneath layer 1. They're nested, you can tell because they're indented. So if I were to actually import this file as it is now into After Effects, I would still only have this one layer because all of my other layers are still nested into this one layer. So what we need to do is take all of these layers, I'm selecting the first one, holding Shift and selecting the last one, and I'm going to just move these up and out of layer 1. So now you can see that they're all on their own layers and they're not nested in layer 1. Now if we import this into After Effects, we'll have all of these different layers. But they're all just going to be named what we see here, which is not very helpful. So it's going to be a lot of help if we name our layers right now, so when we get into After Effects, we know what we're working with. So to rename a layer, you can just go over and hit this little area right here to bring up the box, and that will tell you what you are clicking on so you can tell what you should name it. And this is actually looking like it's grouped, but I want to separate these out. Maybe I'm gonna like change the name of this series or something, and I won't have ability to edit the text if these things are grouped. So what I'm gonna do is just toggle down that layer. Yep, they're grouped. I'm gonna do the ungrouping keyboard shortcut, which is Command Shift and G. Now you can see there's those two things inside of there. So I could do that release layers to sequence again, but another way to create a new layer is just to go down to the bottom of your layer panel and just hit the plus button, and it's created this new layer. And then I can just click on one of these with the little selection box here and then drag it into that layer by dragging the little selection box in the layer panel. So now this is in its own layer, and so I'll just double click on the layer name to enter a new name and then just hit enter. And then this is going to be fundamentals. We can just close that up. And then I'm just going to go through and start naming all these layers. If you have multiple things that are kind of like the same thing, like these little dot grids, you could just name them like dot grid 2 and just number them. As you're going through your layers, look for things that need to be separated further, like I just did with the AE and the fundamentals, and also things that maybe don't need to be separated. So these 3 bars here, I don't need those to be separated because I'm just gonna have this playhead graphic moving across them, but these bars aren't gonna be animated separately. But right now they're all on separate layers. So what I can do is just select all of these, all 3 of these bars. You can see that they're selected over here in the layers panel too. And I'm just gonna hit Command G to group them, and that'll move them all into the same layer. And then these empty layers, I can just click to select those and then go down to the trash can in the layer panel to delete them. So now these are gonna be all in one thing. So I'm just gonna name these and continue on. So here's another thing that I've come to that needs to be separated out further. Right now, this is all just one group, but in order to animate this graph moving in any way, other than just like moving as a whole, kind of like this, I'm gonna need to separate each of these elements out. So I'm just gonna toggle down the layer. I can see that it's grouped, so I'm gonna do Command Shift G to ungroup. And then let's see, it looks like this is all one group, but I actually want this line to get bigger, like get longer, so that it can look like you're pulling this handle to adjust the graph. So I'm gonna need to ungroup again. And so now I have all these different pieces, and same thing for this other side. And then this whole graph is its own path. So now we can take all of these and separate them into layers. So again, we're just gonna click the layer that they're within, go up to the hamburger, and then release to layers sequence. And then remember to select them and drag them out. And that's gonna leave this empty layer that they were originally in, so you can just delete that. To name all of these little pieces of the graph that I just separated into their own layers, I'm gonna go graph and then name them what they are. And since there's 2 of these little squares, this will just be square left. And then this one will be graph circle left. By naming all parts of the same element like this, it just helps me to quickly glance at my layer stack and see what's what. This layer 1 here is the original layer that all of my artwork was within, so I can just delete that because it's empty. It's not a bad idea to have extra layers in your Illustrator file in case you want to add an element. If you decide to add layers after you've already imported into After Effects, it's not going to work out. So if you think that you might want to add something that I do is just add a bunch of extra layers. I usually just bring them to the bottom and then just kind of have them there as empty layers if I want to add an element later on, after I've imported into After Effects. So the next thing we need to do is save this file. Like I talked about in lesson 2 of this series about importing and organizing files, I've created a project file called AE Fundamentals that is going to house all of the files for this project. So in here, I will have all of my After Effects files, and then in the AI folder, I will have all of the Illustrator files. So I've saved this file that we just worked on into the Illustrator file. Now let's jump into After Effects. I'm starting in After Effects with a new project. If you watched lesson 2 of this series about importing, you know that there's a couple ways to import. I'm going to do the way that I usually do it, which is the keyboard shortcut of Command-I. And then I'm going to navigate to where I saved that Illustrator file and then select it. I'm going to import this the wrong way just to show you what it looks like so that in case you accidentally do this, you can recognize your mistake. If you don't see these options right here, just click on the Options button. I'm going to import this as footage and just hit open. Now with this pop-up window, I have a second chance to choose how I want to import this, but let's just keep going with footage so you can see what it looks like. So now we have this Illustrator artwork.ai file in the project panel, but I need to bring this into a composition. So I'm going to create a new composition with this one in it by just clicking and dragging this onto this little composition icon down here. And now it's going to open that up in the timeline. You can see that it's created a new composition and open that in the timeline. But this is just that one single layer that we can't do anything with. And that's because we imported it as footage. So let me undo that and go back and show you how to import it another way. So I'm going to do Command-I. And now if I choose import as composition, let's see how that works. So if I open this, now I have a folder and a composition that it's created. Let's just double click to open this composition. So now I have all of these layers that I separated out, which is really great. But if we select one of the layers, you can see this selection box is all the way at the edge of my composition. But this AE, if I just turn off the eyeball to toggle the visibility, that's just this little icon right here. So it doesn't really make sense that the bounding box is way out here. And that has to do with how we imported it. It's going to be the same way for every single layer. So if I select any of the layers, the bounding box of that layer is the size of the composition. And again, that's because of the way that we imported it. So I'm going to again undo this. And let's go back and import Command-I. Select the file again, and this time let's do it the right way. So import as, I'm going to choose composition retain layer sizes. And then hit open. And now it's created a composition, it's created the folder. By the way, the folder has all of the different layers, just as an Illustrator file. And what we really want is this composition. So I'm just going to double click to open the composition. And then we have all the layers labeled as we labeled them. And now if I click on one of the layers, it's just going to have the bounding box just around that one layer, which is going to make it a lot easier to actually select things in the composition viewer and just to work with these layers because their bounding box is closer to where they actually are rather than the size of the entire composition. So that's why import as composition retain layer sizes is so important. Now that you have your artwork imported like this, you can animate any of your layers. So if you toggle down one of the layers and then toggle down next to transform, you can see that they have the same transform properties that most layers do. So let's just go and let's take this keyframe shape. And if you have a lot of layers on your timeline, an easy way to kind of scroll to that layer is just to hit the X key on the keyboard, and that'll just bring that layer to the top of your timeline. It's not actually moving any of these layers, it's just scrolling you to that layer. So now if I toggle this one down, let's animate the scale property. So I'm just going to set a keyframe and then bring the scale up to be really big. And now notice that the edges of this shape are getting pixelated. But Adobe Illustrator is a vector program, as opposed to a raster program which works in pixels. Vectors are supposed to maintain their crispness even if you scale them up. So why is this getting pixelated? It's because After Effects is actually a raster program that works in pixels. So what we can do is click this little button under the sun icon, and this is the continuously rasterize button. So if we just click there to toggle continuously rasterize on for our shape, now notice that this edge is nice and crisp again. So what continuously rasterize is doing is telling After Effects to do the math to calculate those vectors to make the shape nice and crisp for every single frame. So if you know that you're going to scale your Illustrator layers up, or if you notice that they're getting pixelated, just make sure that you turn on the continuously rasterize button. On a related note, if you zoom into your composition viewer, either by using this drop down or hitting the period key on the keyboard, and you get really close to your illustration, and you notice that things are still pixelated even when you turn on continuously rasterize, that's because After Effects is still a raster program, so when you get really close, like 1600%, it's still going to be pixelated. So it's normal for things to be pixelated when you're this zoomed in. Also, just make sure that you're making your artwork big enough. For reference, this composition and what I normally work with is 1920 by 1080. You can see the size of your artwork without even going back to Illustrator just by clicking on the composition, and then the size will be displayed here. If you watched lesson 2 of the AE Fundamental series, you know that this Illustrator file is linked into this After Effects project file. So if I were to move this Illustrator file on my computer or wherever it's saved, After Effects wouldn't know where it went. So right there, that's telling you that there's a dynamic link between this Illustrator file and the After Effects project file. Let's look at how this dynamic link works. I'm going to go back into my Illustrator file. You can change some certain things about this file, and it will automatically update in After Effects. So for example, I could change the text color here. So if I just go in here and let's change it to something obviously different. And then we need to make sure we save this. So I'm just going to hit Command S and then go back into After Effects, give it a little minute to think, and then it should update. So things like colors can easily be updated in Illustrator, and then the changes will be reflected in After Effects. Back in Illustrator, I'm just going to undo that and then hit save. Now let's say that I wanted to scale this pen tool. Let's make it a little bit smaller. So I'm just holding down Shift to maintain its proportions, and I just scaled it down a little bit. And then I'm going to hit save, and let's go back into After Effects. So it updated the color and it made this pen tool smaller. So that was exactly what I wanted. But now let me show you some things that don't work so well. So back in Illustrator, I'm just going to undo that. And let's say that I actually want to make these bars longer. So I'm going to just drag them out this way. Notice how they're almost touching this graph here. So I'm going to hit save and go back into After Effects. And notice how the bars are not almost touching the graph, but they have gotten longer. So After Effects is not showing exactly what I'm seeing in Illustrator. And this is because of the way that After Effects updates layers. After Effects has maintained the same center point of this graphic, but when I extended these bars to the right, it actually moved the center point to the right, but After Effects just didn't get the memo or something. So just know that sometimes when you update things in Illustrator, you're not going to get the exact same update in After Effects. It's not a perfect dynamic link. So I'm just going to undo resizing those bars and just show you a couple more things that you can't do with the dynamic link. So if I wanted to delete this AE layer for some reason, and I just delete the layer, say yes, and then hit save and go back to After Effects, I'm just going to get this error graphic. So that's fine. You could just delete it here and then you're all good. Also in your layer stack, you'll see that little error graphic. Behind the scenes, I just went and undid all that, but if you want to delete a layer, I would recommend not deleting it in Illustrator, but just deleting it out of your composition in After Effects. Because then if you change your mind, it's still there and you can get it back by going into the folder and then dragging it back in. Another thing that doesn't work with the dynamic link is to add a layer to your Illustrator file. So if you hit the little plus to add a new layer, see we have now layer 38, and then you make a shape in that layer or anything in that layer, and then hit save. If you go back into After Effects, you can wait, but that layer is never going to come. So that's why I like to add these extra blank layers in case I decide I need to add something later. So back in Illustrator, because I created these blank layers, I can actually put this star into one of those layers. So I'm just going to drag it in to this layer 37, and then let's just delete layer 38 because it's not going to be useful. And that star is now behind the background, so that's why we can't see it. But if I hit save and then go back into After Effects, that layer 37 now has something in it. So I'm just going to bring that layer all the way to the top. And you still can't see it, but notice how something is selected down here in the corner. If I bring this onto the screen, you can see that that star is now visible. So it just always puts the blank layers down in this bottom left corner, but if you drag them in, you will have your layers. So that's kind of a tricky way to be able to add additional layers after you've already imported your Illustrator file. One thing that you can do is you can add to an existing layer. So let's say that on this fundamentals text layer, I want to add a little star at the end or something. So I can add that star, hit save, and then go back into After Effects, and it will update with that star. You might have noticed that this layer shifted over a little bit, and that's just because of the way that After Effects is looking at the bounding box and the center point. So your Illustrator and After Effects isn't going to be identical because it's not a perfect dynamic link. You can convert artwork imported from Illustrator into native After Effects shapes. To show you how to do it, I'll just use this toggle one as an example. So you could either right click on this in the composition viewer or in the timeline. So right click and then go to create shapes from vector layer. And in Illustrator, I made this as just a path with a stroke and no fill, and that's exactly what I'm seeing here in After Effects. Also notice that the original Illustrator vector layer is turned off now, and there's this new shape layer that is called Toggle 1 Outlines. You can tell that it's a shape layer because it has the little star icon rather than the Illustrator icon. Shape layers always have this star icon. So if I toggle this down, you can see that now I have contents, which I don't have for Illustrator layers. And inside of here, there is the path and the stroke. So now I could animate the stroke. I could animate the stroke weight or adjust it. And I could change the color. I could add dashes, tapers, waves, all kinds of stuff. I also have this path option. So I could animate the path or just adjust it. So I could click the stopwatch to start setting keyframes and then go forward in time. And I just need to click back onto this path to get those anchor points, and then I could just move this up, and now we have this animation. This option to convert Illustrator artwork into native After Effects shape layers can be really powerful because it can give you more options to animate your artwork. There's actually another way to transfer artwork from Illustrator into After Effects so that it's already a native shape layer. If you find yourself often wanting to convert a lot of layers into shape layers, or you just find that the dynamic link between Illustrator and After Effects is a little bit frustrating, you might want to check out Overlord. I'm going to create a new composition just to give you a quick demo of how Overlord works. So with my new composition, I'm just going to use this little Overlord panel to quickly jump back to Illustrator, which is just a simple, handy feature that it has. So now what I can do is push any of these shapes into After Effects. So first, let's just push the background shape. So with the background selected, I'm just going to hit this push button, and that automatically brings it into After Effects as a shape layer. So that's a bonus because you can animate any of the shape properties that an Illustrator layer that's imported the traditional way wouldn't have. So if I go back into Illustrator, I can also do gradients, and this gradient will have all of the gradient settings ready for me to adjust because it's a native After Effects gradient. You can push multiple shapes into After Effects all at the same time. So if you just select them over here with these little selection boxes, I've selected all these toggles, and if I turn on this little icon right here, then it's going to split them all into their own layers, just like I have them in Illustrator. I can push them all at the same time. And so these are all their own layers. Super handy. If you push text into After Effects, it'll make it into a text layer so that it's easily editable. When you import text the traditional way, it's just an Illustrator layer and it's not editable as text. I'm telling you about Overlord not because I'm trying to sell you something, but because this is how I actually work between Illustrator and After Effects for at least 90% of my work. And it would feel dishonest to omit that from this lesson. I like Overlord because it gives me more flexibility between design and animation. I don't have to worry about knowing what all my layers are going to be and not having the ability to add them once I import my Illustrator file into After Effects. With Overlord, I can work on my Illustrator file and then import whatever layers that I need when I need them, and then maybe do a test animation and change things without worrying about what the dynamic link between Illustrator and After Effects is going to do. I feel like I have more control with Overlord. If you're just starting out, it's important to understand how to import artwork from Illustrator into After Effects the traditional way that I covered in this video. And you can continue to work this way for as long as it works for you. Overlord is not a necessity, but if you feel like it could benefit you, you can learn all about it in my class, Top 5 Plugins for Efficiency in Adobe After Effects. And because I'm such a fan of Overlord, I got you a coupon so you can use my code EXPLANIMATED for $10 off. The next video in this series covers how to work with effects. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, happy animating.